Hey everyone, this is a piece by Hal Draper, and it's a review of Tony Cliff's Russia, published in 1955. Here we go. Tony Cliff's work is not one of those over-plentiful books on Russia which merely set out to describe, cuss out, or philosophize about the horrors of Stalinism. It is a serious and valuable study from a Marxist viewpoint of the nature of the Russian state. The author, long a leading Trotskyist in England and now associated with the Left Labor Socialist Review, believes that the best theoretical description of the Stalinist system is, quote, bureaucratic state capitalist. And we will have to say a word about his handling of this state capitalist theory, but his political conclusions are very close to, if not identical with those of independent socialism. Apart from this point of view, however, Cliff's Stalinist Russia does a preliminary job in its first two long chapters, which is alone worth the price of the book. These two chapters present an analytical description of the social and political conditions of Stalinism, virtually constituting a handbook on why Stalinism is not socialism. And this is done by marshalling a vast amount of factual material based on official Stalinist sources, laws, publications, etc. The first chapter does this job on the socio-economic relations of the Stalinist system, including the destruction of workers' control, role of the trade unions, the quote trade unions, the wage system, legal restrictions on the worker, draconian punishments for lateness or other offenses, position of women in society, slave labor, depression of the standard of living and subordination of consumer goods production, the productivity of labor under Stalinism, expropriation of the peasantry, the turnover tax, the atrocities of the criminal law, the advance of inequality and salary differentiation, etc. And finally, in this chapter, Cliff presents an excellent discussion of the unplannedness of this, quote, planned economy, stemming from the built-in dislocations of bureaucratic mismanagement. In Chapter 2, State and Party in Stalinist Russia, Cliff is equally authoritative summaries of the Russian reality on the structure of the armed forces, the role of the, quote, Soviet organs of government, the rigging of the elections, the monolithism of the party, etc. All of this material is fully documented as to sources. In the course of taking up many of these questions, Cliff counterposes the Stalinist reality to the Russia of Lenin and Trotsky, making clear the gulf between the Stalinist counter-revolution and the Bolshevik state which this counter-revolution destroyed. Socialists have long looked forward to a contribution of this sort. An approach to it, and a useful one, was a selection entitled Soviet Myth and Reality in one of Arthur Koestler's books, an otherwise vapid collection of essays whose title, The Yogi and the Commissar, has become better known than any of its contents. There was a report some years ago, I remember, that this section was going to be expanded to book size by Koestler and Dwight MacDonald, but nothing seems to have come of it, if it was true. In any case, Cliff's two chapters represent the best accomplishment of this task to date for its size. Much of the material is in the subsequent sections of Cliff's book, dealing with the nature of the system, is devoted to refuting the view that Russia is a, quote, worker state, or, quote, socialist state. An excellent chapter, which appears as an appendix, deals directly with an examination of Trotsky's definitions of Russia as a degenerated worker state. It is a very effective attack on this theory, which has led to the present extreme degeneration of both wings of the, quote, orthodox Trotskyist movement and its Fourth International. In a couple of other chapters, 3 and 4, Cliff describes a great deal of material which would be a necessary part of any Marxist discussion of the nature of Stalinism. These take up some general considerations about, quote, worker states, and then the material heritage of pre-October Revolution society in Russia. It is the next 3 chapters which attempt to present the theory of, quote, state capitalism as applied to Russia. Of course, as our readers know, This theory is quite mistaken in our opinion, but since this is not the place to polemicize against it, it is more important to note what kind of, quote, state capitalist theory is this one of Cliff's. For there are all kinds of people who have applied this label of state capitalism to Russia with quite different political and theoretical meanings, just as, for that matter, the same is true of our own label of bureaucratic collectivism. But we have often pointed out that the, quote, state capitalist theory sometimes shades into versions which make it virtually identical with our own. This tends to happen where the, quote, state capitalism, which is seen in Russia, is analyzed as being so basically different from, quote, private capitalism that it tends to take on the characteristics of a new social system, which is not the same as any other existing system, which is labeled a hyphenated capitalism only as a matter of terminological taste. Cliff's analysis does not begin this way, but it tends to wind up so. To begin with, Cliff makes a brave attempt to subsume the Russian Stalinist, quote, capitalist system within the same Marxist economic categories as the old capitalism. With Cliff, as with all others who have attempted this feat, it boils down to stripping capitalism of all essential attributes which do not fit into the Stalinist picture, and, as with all others, the first of these attributes to go is capitalist profit as the motor of the system. But Cliff moves from this type of analysis to something else, which becomes increasingly important for Cliff's analysis till it governs his political conclusions. This is heavy stress on the importance of the difference between the two different, quote, state capitalisms which he finds himself discussing. One state capitalism is that which is, quote, an organic gradual continuation of the development of capitalism, end quote. The other is the, quote, state capitalism which arose gradually on the ruins of a workers' revolution, end quote. At the point where Cliff makes this distinction explicit, Cliff also reveals the Achilles heel of his whole theory. Quote, historical continuity in the case of state capitalism, which evolves from monopoly capitalism, bracket, the first type, end bracket, is shown in the existence of private property, parenthesis, bonds, end parenthesis. Historical continuity in the case of state capitalism, which evolves from a worker state that degenerated and died, is shown in the non-existence of private property. The non-existence of private property, end quote. Cliff. The italics are Cliff's, and Cliff's answer to this question of historical continuity is vital for Cliff. For it is the same as asking, what is the systematic common ground between capitalism and this, quote, state capitalism of Cliff's, which did not and cannot arise from capitalism? Which did not and cannot arise from capitalism. When Cliff answers, quote, non-existence of private property, end quote, the game is up, I think, for obviously this, quote, non-existence shows only that the old capitalism has not been resuscitated and says nothing at all about the positive question of what it is that has grown up on the ruins of the workers' state. However, I cite this to show how Cliff's analysis moves over to the more fruitful question of the gulf between the capitalist world and the Stalinist, quote, state capitalist system. And it seems to me that it would be easy to show that every one of Cliff's political and even social conclusions flows from his analysis of the differences between the two systems, and not at all from his, parenthesis, to me, end parenthesis, labored exposition of the, quote, capitalist nature of Stalinism. So in the final two chapters, where Cliff takes up the imperialist expansion of Russia and the class struggle in Russia, the sharp point of his analysis is directed against any conception of the, quote, progressiveness of Stalinism and toward a revolutionary opposition to the whole system. Cliff's political standpoint is that of the third camp and makes no compromise with any illusions about Stalinism. This is its political strength. Without any doubt, the book belongs in every socialist library. And that's the end of the review, and that was from Labor Action, 16th of January, 1956. Here's another review. It's an appendix. Anti-Stalinist. It says Anti-Stalinist Encyclopedia, reviewed by Hal Draper of The Soviet Regime, Communism in Practice, by W. W. Kalski, Syracuse University Press, 1954. In January, in reviewing Tony Cliff's book Stalinist Russia, I mentioned that it does a great job in its first couple of chapters in assembling a documented mass of material on the conditions of the people under the Stalinist regime, that it was in fact, quote, the best accomplishment of this task to date, for its size, end quote. The reason for the italicized qualification was the existence of Kalski's book, which is truly unique and which has no close competitors. Kalski's The Soviet Regime is in every sense a one-volume encyclopedia precisely on the subject of documenting the conditions of the Stalinist regime, quote, out of their own mouths, end quote, particularly out of their own laws and official documents. Do not confuse this job with that performed or even attempted by any other among the scads and slews of books on Russia that came out of the publisher's assembly line. Feinsad's bulky How Russia is Ruled, for example, also has an encyclopedic, or at least textbookish air about it, but does not really compare. Kalski does not pretend to be making any political or sociological analysis as he goes along, except perhaps incidentally in comments. Kalski is interested solely in presenting the factual material itself, and this is an advantage from this reviewer's standpoint because it means the book has a minimum of mere anti-communist agitation in it. It is solid, packed with fact and quotations, intelligently marshaled, organized and presented to document the whole picture. Since this goes on from page 1 to page 607, it can be imagined what a bursting storehouse of such information this book is. I do not mean by this that the tone of the book is, quote, objective. Professor Kalski, on the contrary, writes and presents his material as an indictment of the regime. The book is divided into 4 parts: cultural isolation and conformity, state and party, worker and social stratification, peasant and collective farming, with a 5th part on the post-Stalin era up to 1954. It would be useless to try to list all the subjects covered in the chapters under these heads because they cover practically everything. The first part on, quote, culture also includes the various aspects of the drive for ideological conformity in art, history, writing, science, sports, linguistics, nationalism, parenthesis, in the it says, parenthesis, in re, the non-Russian nationalities of the country, end parenthesis, etc. Under the section State and Party, was I saying his name right? No, it's Kalski. Kalski, it says. Under the section State and Party, Kalski covers not only all the obvious subjects like elections, governmental structure, nature of the party and its control of all other institutions, all individual freedoms and rights, but also criminal law, the courts, family and marriage problems, youth, and political aspects of non-Russian nationality questions. The third part, of course, goes into all the ramifications of labor's lot, from wages and working conditions to bureaucratic factory management, housing, labor control, women's work, social security, and class stratification. The 4th part is similarly extensive on the exploitation of the peasants and the organization of the collective farm system. Quote, this work, says Professor Kalski in his introduction, quote, is intended to provide a reference book which will give indirect access to Soviet sources. To avoid the reproach of intending to make propaganda of any sort, I have limited myself to Soviet sources only, refraining from the use of foreign commentaries and second-hand accounts. I want the reader to hear Soviet legislators, politicians, and authors speak directly. This method falls to provide only one important kind of information, that concerning the actual conditions of inmates of the Soviet correctional labor camps. But the official reasons and judicial and administrative procedures for confinement to the camps are fully discussed because the Soviet state makes no secret of them. End quote. Kolsky. This well describes the unique character of this work and is a guide to what one can and cannot expect from its contents. It is not the sort of book that one reads through, and I confess that I have not done so. I have been dipping into it for its sections on various separate subjects, as one usually does with a reference book. As one might expect from the author's background, Polish government in exile, some of its political judgments made in passing are of the standard bourgeois type, but it is not worthwhile criticizing this further. In this space, political enlightenment is not its forte, but if, say, you want to document the draconian Russian law penalizing workers for coming late to their jobs, or any other such concrete fact, this book is what you need. And again, that was from Hal Draper, and that was published in Labor Action, 19th of March, 1956.